Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's get started. So, welcome one and all. Today we are talking about men's mental health, particularly accepting and expressing emotions, right? So, one thing before we start out, I would encourage everyone, if you have any questions, please feel free to message them to me directly via the chat feature. I assume that as we kind of go through, there will be some questions. We will come to those at the end altogether. I would also say that there are going to be moments where I'm going to encourage you all to answer openly and honestly. Again, what I would say to everybody is that feel free to be open with your thoughts and feelings and opinions and all of that, whether you choose to do it in the main chat or whether you wish to send me responses individually, all are encouraged. This is not going to be what we call like a judgmental space of any sort, or at least I hope not. And again, the more we can be clear about our own thoughts and feelings about all of these topics, the the more clarity we can all get as a group, right? If you have a question or if you have a thought or a feeling that you'd like to sort of be known when we go through some of the parts where I'm going to ask for inputs from all of you, just know that other people are probably thinking the same thing too, right? So let's get started. First and foremost, I want to welcome you all, and I wanted to encourage you all to have a few quick thoughts before we get started. Mainly, what we're going to do first is a little exercise where we go through some common misconceptions about men's mental health, right? So, when we talk about men's mental health, does it sound familiar when we say your mental health will burden others, right? Is this something that any of you have heard or felt before? Again, you can always respond in chat. But have any of you heard this statement before, or have you perhaps felt this way, or been told this at some point, or were made to understand this that, you know, your mental health is going to be a burden to the other people around you? Is that anything that's ever come up? Okay, good. I see a yes in chat. Excellent. Thank you. And if I had to sort of ask you all to consider, you know, how many of y'all, just by show of hands, if a friend or a person close to you asked you for their support, I'm sorry, asked you for your support in their difficult times, how many of you do you think would be okay lending that help, being supportive, and sort of being a patient listener in that time? Show of hands, how many of you would be comfortable providing some support to somebody who reached out to you, particularly men, right? Because this is about men's mental health. But if a male friend, colleague, family member reached out, you'd be okay providing that support? I see two hands up. Yes. And I see someone in chat also said, yes, we'll be happy to do that. Okay, good. Six hands. Wow. 6 out of 47. I'm I'm concerned. I excellent. Thank you. More people kind of chiming in there. Excellent. I think it's fair to say that most people would lend support, right? But I now want to ask the men in the audience, and I'd say everybody sort of lower your hand for a second, right? How many of you do you think would be comfortable asking for that support? Any men in the audience, you feel like you would be comfortable asking for that support? Are a majority of men in the audience going to reach out and ask for support? Yes, I see some responses. Someone has said not comfortable, no, not used to asking for help. Thank you so much for participating. Someone did also say yes, right? But again, the tendency is no, we don't tend to ask for help, right? As men, by and large, we're not socialized to asking for help. And this is one of those reasons that sort of plays into it, right? One big thing that we see in this particular fact that your mental health will burden other people frequently. As men, we're put in the role of responsibility for a couple things, right? For quite a few things. And very often it means that we're not allowed or we don't allow ourselves to be a burden to other people, even though most people would be happy to provide that support, right? I think it's probably true of most men that you'd be comfortable being supportive for others, but not comfortable asking for that support if you were to need it, right? What else? Men just don't get emotional. I think, most of us, because I did also say that this is about misconceptions, most of us are pretty set with the idea that yes, obviously men do get emotional, right? Show of hands, are men more likely to express anger or are they more likely to express anxiety or worry? Let's say raise your hand if you think it's anger, keep it down if you think it's worry. All right, good. I see a good number of people noticing. Okay, good, good, good. Eight of you, at least seven, eight, are saying yes, men are more likely to sort of express anger, right? Do you think there's any particular reason why, men are more okay showing anger or frustration versus, let's say, sadness or worry or anxiety or shame or guilt? Does anybody have any thoughts as to why this happens? Are there other emotions that we are and are not allowed to sort of show? What do you think? All right. Okay. Anger, rage, more acceptable traits for men, right? Someone pointed out this is largely because of society. Someone else said, yes, this is because of social taboos. Excellent. Okay. And someone also pointed out very importantly, we grow up suppressing these emotions. And someone else also has pointed out lack of time to look into all of these things, and that leads to anger. So, main point here, of course, we can recognize that yes, men do have emotions, right? There's just certain ones that we are allowed to show and that we are not allowed to show. What about this? A man should be able to control his feelings. Let me ask a simple question. How do any of you control your feelings? How does one go about controlling their feelings? What are common ways that we control our feelings? Again, to the men and women in the audience, of course. How do you go about controlling your feelings? Let's say you have a bad day. Let's say you have something that's a worry or a stressor. How does one normally deal with that? Any thoughts? Anyone have any thoughts on how one normally deals with it? Okay. How one normally yep, someone said being optimistic. All right. Yeah, changing mindset. Someone pointed out being alone. That's a very important one. Again, and this is largely for the men in the audience, but how many of you feel like it's a somewhat common thing for men to isolate when we feel these intense negative emotions, whether it's anger, shame, depressive feelings, anxious feelings? How many of us either know other men who do that or do that ourselves? We go and be by ourselves and we have difficult feelings. Show of hands. How many of you think that men are predisposed to sort of isolate, be by themselves, right? Yeah. Okay. I see a good eight, nine hands up, right? Okay. Someone interestingly pointed out in the chat that one way to deal with it is by discussing with your close friends, right? But we do the opposite thing. And again, I think that comes down to that previous factor of your mental health will be a burden to others. And we don't want to be a burden to others, do we? Because we have that responsibility as men that, okay, we can't be a burden to others. In fact, we have to be there to support, but we cannot be a burden, right? So these are very common, ways of sort of addressing that. Someone pointed out being alone is a medicine to kind of get some peace in mind. That's actually, for some people, it can be that, but mostly in terms of mental health, in terms of how we look at how stress, anxiety, sad thoughts, and feelings affect us, it's sort of a negative tendency to isolate, right? There's such a thing as an unhealthy level of loneliness or isolation when it comes to these feelings. What about this? Real men don't ask for help. Again, I think this is a statement that most of us we can sort of notice that there are some issues with this one, right? First up, what it means to be a real man is sort of, changes by our society's definition. I'm sure somebody who's 20 today will have a different answer for that than somebody who is 60, right? But again, this is just a common thing that socially, culturally, we've been grown up, taught, or we've seen, right? Real men don't ask for help. Very common mindset. Men can recover on their own, right? Now, I think this is one of those things, but how many of you have heard this, seen this, either in yourself, your elders, friends, family, things like that? How many times have you heard this thought that men can bounce back on their own, or men can sort of, just recover by themselves. Someone very pointed out we seek advice rather than asking for help, right? Yeah, that's a good point. But how many of you have come across this mindset that like men either can recover on their own or that they're expected to recover on their own when it comes to difficult emotions, when it comes to any mental health concern? Show of hands? Okay, all right. Fewer people, but definitely this is an idea that's still out there, right? Good. Okay. See, again, these are not, again, we all kind of started from the point of view, and I opened by saying that these are misconceptions, and they are absolutely that. But by and large, it's tricky to sort of say, it's easy to sort of understand logically why these things are not really true. But in terms of our upbringing, in terms of what we actually practice and what we actually feel, it becomes difficult, right? And this one is an interesting one. Some disorders don't affect men, right? So this is a place where I think a little bit more information and some data can come in handy. But very simply, research tells us that, men and women equally likely to suffer from some mental health struggle or the other, but sometimes some disorders do disproportionately affect, men versus women, right? For instance, we do see one pattern that when it comes to substance use disorders, whether it's alcohol, nicotine, any other hard drugs, those tend to affect men a little bit more, right? Why do you think men are naturally sort of prone to addiction differently to women, or why do you think this pattern is there? That when it comes to addictive disorders, we generally see more men than women. Anyone have any ideas about that? Addiction on its own has no gender bias, yes, but that's the effect of addiction. Biologically, it has no real gender bias, but we do see that men sometimes are more prone to it in practice, right? So let me put it to you differently. Do you think it is more acceptable or less acceptable for men to, let's say, drink or smoke versus women when it comes to dealing with difficult feelings? Because the alcohol is the same, right? How many of you agree with that statement? Men with smoking and drinking as sort of examples is more socially acceptable than it is for women to engage in those same activities because that's a different taboo for them. Okay, I do see some hands up. Yeah, absolutely. See, the interesting thing is the alcohol, the drugs, the smoking, the nicotine, it's the same compound. It affects everyone equally. It has the same effect on the human brain for both men and women. But the reason that so many of these factors are different is because of that social acceptability, right? What we think of as socially acceptable for both genders is without a doubt different, right? Now, the thing is, when it comes to that, this is a big part of why certain taboos are there, certain stigmas are there, but very importantly, not all of that necessarily has to be how we behave, right? Just because it is normal, just because something is normalized does not mean that it is a good thing. And this is what we're here to talk about today. And let's start with this very straightforward thing. Why is there a difference in conversation about men's health and women's mental health, right? So, one, social factors, right? Peer influence, someone has pointed out, right? Yeah, absolutely. So, when it comes to that, right? When it comes to those particular things, that's where it starts. Now, let's dive into it a little deeper. So, we've got three main objectives here, right? First, we're going to talk about all the factors that impact men's mental health. We're going to learn more about how we accept and express emotion. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about supporting the men in your life, right? Again, this is going to be largely, sort of tailored towards men, but that does not mean that, there's not something useful in here. The understanding by both men, women, and others is very important to seeing how these factors arise, and changing them means, taking your own small steps in your day-to-day life for a bigger societal change, right? If each of you go out there and do something a little differently, there'll be a ripple in the pond, and more ripples, more and more people having these conscious conversations makes a difference. So let's go through a few quick exercises, right? What are some of the mental health related movies that you've seen? And I would like some responses. And here's what I want you to do. Think about men or women both. And I want you to tell me which movie, was it a man or a woman, and what was the disorder that they had? Right? Let's try and examine the effect of pop culture in all of this. So, when you see, you know, see this in, okay, all right. So, we have one example of Laksh where Ritik changes due to mental stress. Okay, good. Acha. Someone pointed out Tamasha, but I don't see the gender or the disorder. Keep in mind, I may not have seen all these movies. Not everybody else in the audience would have seen these movies either. Okay. Goodwill Hunting, very different. Yeah. Detachment issues was the thing. Okay. Are we talking about, so for Goodwill Hunting again, movie, gender, and what was the disorder, right? So let's think about this. Okay. Someone pointed out Karthik calling Karthik. Okay. Tamasha was bipolar disorder, and was it a male or a female character? That's what I want to figure out. Karthik calling Karthik was, I believe, schizophrenia, right? Or dissociative identity disorder. Okay, all right. I think if you sit long and if you sit for a while, you'll kind of see that there is a definite bias. Again, as we saw earlier, it's more socially acceptable for men to sort of be angry. It's more acceptable for men to be aggressive or violent and all of those kinds of things out in public. Whereas with women, even in pop culture and movies, we tend to see more of that depression, that anxiety, those stress related issues, all those other things. And very often, how often do you see movies about men in therapy, right? Versus, and think about, just a general opinion. Do you see in TV, movies, shows, things like that, do you more often see men going to therapists and psychologists, or do you see women by and large going more to psychologists, professionals, psychiatrists, things like that? Now, yeah, I think if you look long and hard at the pattern, it plays into that same point we made earlier that culturally, what we see in the media, what we see in the pop culture around us, it informs our sense of what is normal, right? Or what is status quo, or what is, the usual thing that men and women do. And, with pop culture, it's a circle, right? Real life informs media, but the media also reinforces real life. Now, when we create this loop, what we see is that by and large, one, it creates some misconceptions about mental health in general because only the very serious disorders get put into movies. And what that says is, unless you have one of those very serious disorders, you don't really need professional help. So people wait for things to go bad before they seek professional help, and that's for men and women. And the other thing that you by and large see is that as a result, we learn that some things are not acceptable for men and some things are acceptable for women when it comes to seeking help, right? Now, let's go a little further. Let's talk about some of the stats and some of the big sort of elephant in the room moments here, right? So, about 13 million men suffered from anxiety related disorders in India in the year 2018, right? These are based on sort of peer reviewed data and studies. Again, men in the age group of 30 to 49 years are the ones who are seen to be most impacted by this, right? And can I just get a show of hands if you're comfortable? Can I just ask how many men fall into that bracket in the audience today? Can you raise your hand? 30 to 49. Can I just get the men in the audience aged 30 to 49 just to raise their hands? I just want to see what percentage of my audience today is possibly potentially at risk in need of some of the best or most important supports here, right? Okay, I'm doubtful there's just five of you. I'm very doubtful there are only five people, but I'm going to encourage everyone to participate here as well, right? Next, also in 2020, and you can lower your hands as well. In 2020, more than 70% of callers to India's national mental health helpline were men, right? Now, again, I say this as a therapist, and this is anecdotal evidence at some level, but I think it's a pattern that most people see is that by and large, there's a greater tendency for women to use therapy than men. Why do you think we see this difference? Why do you think that 70% of the callers to the helpline, the hotline, you know, are men, but by and large, we tend to see women tend to utilize these mental health services a little bit more. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that could be? Could I get some responses in chat? Why do you think men might be more likely to use a hotline than weekly therapy, or go to see a psychiatrist for medication? Any guesses? Well, there's a few things, right? One, oh, someone pointed out very big letters, anonymity, and someone else made a very important point. Women can share in their social circles. Yes, very important, right? And again, maybe the women in the audience can also confirm this for me, but women's social circles, there is sort of a code where women do stand by each other, right? There is a greater sense of community and friendship and solidarity for women when it comes to their mental health, when it comes to their struggles, than perhaps there is for men. Would you all agree with that? Someone pointed out a very important three-word statement, log kya kahenge? Absolutely right. Anonymity is a big part of this. So yeah, I do see some responses saying yes, men and women stand by each other and support their mental health differently, right? By and large, men, even amongst each other, we don't talk about our mental health all that much, right? So to that end, what exactly contributes to that? First and foremost, first and very much foremost, social conditioning is a huge part of that, right? Very significant contributing factor. And it makes up for a lot of what worsens men's mental health in both direct and indirect ways, right? So let's talk a little bit more about what that is. There's five main points here, right? First and foremost, we have a lot of stereotypes on what it is to be a man, right? Now, if I had to impromptu sort of ask everybody in the audience, what do you think makes a man? Men and women, by the way, please, everybody feel free to participate in this. Impressions on all sides are important. But if you had to take a stereotype of what makes a man, what do you think it is? What are the first words that come to your mind when you say, okay, this is what it is to be a man? Think about it. Take a second, chime in. These responses are very important. And like I said, be honest, be as honest and candid as you can be. If you're not comfortable putting it in everybody's chat, send it to hosts and panelists only. But I'd like you to think about what the first thing is when you say, what does it mean to be a man? Yep, one immediate response is, I think multiple people have responded with responsible. I think I got three immediate responses saying, yeah, responsibility, right? Okay, physically strong, good. Generosity, which is a different one. Yes. So the idea is to someone who can live with a battle scar. Very important. With men, sometimes, there is this little undertone that sometimes we glorify a sense of suffering by ourselves, right? We think that maybe handling your things alone, that suffering has some meaning, that suffering has some point, that it's necessary, to struggle through things, right? Someone also chimed in, yes, responsibility again, right? So here's the thing. At the end of the day, you have to ask how many of these ideas are really useful, right? And with time, of course, that definition of what it is to be a man changes with time, and you are part of that process today. One thing that also goes with being a man seems to be that we don't talk about our feelings. We don't stay open about this. We don't have conversations with each other about this. And that in fact, it might belittle us to do that, which is absolutely not the case because that doesn't help us, right? We know that men are about four times more likely to die by suicide than women. Now, again, to give that data some more specificity, women are more likely to attempt suicide, but men are far more likely to actually complete it and die by suicide, right? That's a really important factor. And this mentality generally tends not to help us, right? Next, we have stigma, right? External stigma from society and internalized stigma from ourselves. Now, logically, let's take an example. Me as a therapist, I might say, yeah, obviously, mental health is very good. It's very, very important. I'm all about people getting therapy, but I may not go into therapy, right? Because I have learned this, but I have not internalized that completely. In fact, logically, yes, all of you, I'm sure, are very aware of this stigma. But how many of you would really break that by going out and seeking therapy yourselves? Smaller number, right? Because we have a lot of internalized stigma, though as adults, we know that Yeah, it's wrong for us not to seek help when we really need it. Maybe the messages that we have heard and seen growing up, we've taken some of that stigma that existed in society and absorbed it within ourselves. If you grew up around men in your life who had this mentality of tough it out, be responsible, be the breadwinner, and don't crib about it, men don't cry. If that's what you grew up seeing at an early age, and maybe that's what you've heard, maybe there's a good chance you've internalized that stigma, and that's something to work on, right? That's something that you can change with time. Now, denial, accepting that you have a problem is difficult, and most importantly, it delays help seeking behavior. Now, let me put forward a question to you, right? If you had, let's say, you know, let's say you had somebody who, for example, had cancer. Is cancer better treated in early stages or late stages? Raise your hand if you think it's better treated in early stages. Right, exactly. Right, because it hasn't spread, it hasn't become such a big problem that it's causing major difficulties. In fact, if you can deal with it early and cut it off at the root, it stops from growing into a tree. Right? Mental health is a lot like that. And here's the problem: when we have, let's say, media or pop culture telling us that, look, at any given time, only the most serious illnesses make for good television. Maybe only the most serious illnesses make for good news. In fact, what we see is on the news, we only really talk about mental health when it comes to a special day where we celebrate it for that 1 week or that 1 day or that 1 month, or when else, when there has been like a major celebrity suicide, or when there's been something gruesome or eye-catching, right? It doesn't report on people who have depression but are just living through their lives just at a great personal cost. So when we have these stigmas and all of that, we also kind of have this thing of, I'm not going to treat it like a problem until it is late stage, until I physically can't get out of bed, until I physically can't get up and go to work, until I'm not able to shower, clean myself, I feel too sad, I maybe feel suicidal. That's one example of depression. This is true of everybody. It is probably more true for men, but accepting that you have a problem, you do not have to be completely shut down in order to go and talk to a therapist. In fact, for most of us, it is much easier and much better to try and treat it early, right? Again, I always like to use that metaphor of, you know, if you were to treat cancer, would you wait until it is late stage or would you deal with it early? You would want to deal with it early. You'd want to catch it and you'd want to treat it early. Now, what else? Socially and personally acceptable ways of expressing and managing emotions are often unhealthy. You know, what do you think is an event or one part of life where men are allowed and encouraged to have strong emotions? Right? Can you all think of one part of our day to day where men are allowed to be happy, sad, angry, whatever? Give me some responses in chat. So, what's one context in our day to day life where men are allowed to have strong feelings? Anybody? What do you think? Okay, yeah, childbirth, absolutely. And we got the answer. Cricket. Show of hands. Who has had strong emotions about the World Cup recently? Only two of you have had strong feelings about the World Cup. That's it. I find that very doubtful. Again, I'm going to encourage the audience to participate. Just raise your hand if you agree with this. Is it fair to say that men are allowed to have feelings about sports? That it's completely socially acceptable. If you saw a man crying at the World Cup, you'd understand it, right? It wouldn't be out of touch. It wouldn't be out of right. Exactly. Most of us agree that this is probably the case. Yes, women too. Women too. Absolutely. Someone pointed out in the chat, women are also allowed to have feelings about that. But the big difference is that women, I think, by and large, are allowed to have feelings in more places and with more things than by and large men do, right? How often do you think it's socially acceptable for a man to cry in public, right? Versus women, very different things, right? And that's a simple test. How comfortable, how many times have you seen women crying in public on shows, in real life, in news, whatever, versus men? Very different. Now, what this translates to is that sometimes men can translate their feelings from one area of their life into another where it's more socially acceptable. In fact, we can translate feelings of sadness, grief, anxiety, stress and translate that into anger. And that's what we see very often, is that a lot of our feelings get turned into anger because we are allowed to show that. And that is a socially acceptable feeling that we can show, right? And lastly, we have this one major, oh, hang on just a second. Sorry, last point here. We do have somewhat of a negative attitude towards the idea of struggling and help seeking behavior for distress, right? The negative attitude when it comes to struggling is that sometimes, man, we may glorify this a little bit. We might say that, yes, this is what it is to be a man. You have to struggle, you have to sit with your feelings, you have to not do anything about it. And when men reach out for help about this, we might have the worry that we are going to be judged by others, even though we may not judge others. We would judge ourselves, right, for seeking help when we are in distress. So, things to consider, right? Okay, now, how do these factors play out together? What we see is this complex chain of events, right? Where we're seeing all of these factors happen all at once and they create this overall net effect, right? And that net effect is just sort of a vicious cycle, right? Because we have this pressure to conform and fall into certain stereotypes, we get raised that way, right? Then that stigma kicks in. And then we say, okay, if we don't live up to this, we're going to be judged. If we don't meet those ideals, we're going to be judged, right? And then we also don't want to be judged by others or judge ourselves. So that comes to denial. I don't have a problem. You know, I don't need to go see a therapist. It's not a big enough problem. Everybody deals with this, right? Then we have poor coping skills. And again, just to give a brief definition of it, a coping skill is anything that you do in order to feel better. It could be going to the gym, it could be drinking, it could be smoking, it could be talking to your loved ones, it could be journaling, it could be healthy or unhealthy. Note that every example I gave is not necessarily a healthy example, right? But poor coping are the things that we consider are socially acceptable, right? So when men have a tough time, we might go out for a drink with the guys. We are not going to sit and go to a therapist. We're not going to sit and open up perhaps to loved ones or close friends. We're not really told that that's okay. It's totally okay to pick up a smoking habit, though, right? Chai sutta after work, when you've had a really stressful day, is very normal. Talking about it, not quite as much, right? And then we have a bunch of these negative attitudes, these negative feelings towards seeking help. And overall, what this leads to is it just feeds into itself because then we get compromised mental health. And then that leads back into more stigma, more shame, more denial, increased negative attitudes. And this is how that plays out, right? So, this is one look at what that looks like. Now, for yourself and others, these are common traps, or factors that affect men's mental health. So we tend to convert one feeling into the other, right? Again, stereotypically feminine and stereotypically masculine feelings exist, right? Sadness, vulnerability, grief, these are things that are more easily and more socially acceptable in women than they are in men. And that means when we don't have one outlet for these feelings, we convert them into something else. We express them as anger. We lash out to people. Frequently, we lash out at those that have nothing to do with the feeling that we're having or have nothing to do with the problem that is leading to those feelings, right? Again, we might shift our feelings to another topic, right? I might have a difficult time at home, but I might bring it with me. I might be sad about what's going on at home, but I might bring it with me to work and translate that to anger and take it out on my juniors or my colleagues or my work peers, right? Again, the other side of it is that men, when they express, let's say, some of these feelings, particularly anger, in certain settings, in workplaces, that gets seen as more dominant or that's seen as more acceptable as being assertive, right? Oh, this person might have an anger issue, but that's not atypical for men, right? Which is, again, not really what the main source of it is. It's not really what the main problem is, and it's not solving it. And lastly, we do tend to see not only do a lot of mental health concerns also have strong ties to physical conditions. In men, more likely, since we are very used to suppressing some of these things, and we are frankly encouraged to suppress some of our feelings, it's very common for a lot of disorders to come across as physical ailments that have no real physical cause, right? Headaches, stomach aches, back aches, things like that. We know that anxiety on its own, by the way, has a very strong effect on your overall cardiovascular health. In fact, a lot of chronic stress conditions also show things like, gut ulcers and things like that, right? We know that there is already a link between mind and body. But in men, we do see this complaint more often that, hey, I'm having unexplained headaches, backaches, things like that. And very often it is stress related, right? Because again, we can't get it out in words, but your body is keeping score. Your body does understand and know. Now, why is it a problem? Greater risk of depression and anxiety. Again, if we deal with it in the early stage, great. But we are not trained to deal with it in the early stage. We are only trained to deal with it professionally when it's the late stage, when it's the worst of it. Greater health risk, cardiovascular and metabolic diseases, very, very common in men. And one big thought is that this is related to things like chronic stress and lack of help seeking behaviors. In fact, I believe there are some studies that even say that men have a lesser tendency to even seek medical help compared to women, right? Greater issues with dating and personal intimacy. Again, as men, very often we are not trained to have like an emotional vocabulary. We are not really trained to talk about feelings. And relationships are centered on the idea or the prospect of talking to someone and being emotionally vulnerable with them and communicating with them. So it does lead to this issue of difficulty in dating and interpersonal intimacy, right? Overall, we do see that there is an issue with interpersonal violence in men, right? We are more predisposed. And again, this is very often because those feelings are acceptable in anger, and the anger comes out in some cases as abuse, right? Now, overall, psychological distress, that's the other thing, right? When we don't know what our feelings necessarily are coming from and being expressed at, it just means that they're going to worsen or create more practical problems in your day to day until this creates like that vicious cycle, right? And lastly, we have that strong discouragement in seeking help. Now, we've talked about that plenty. I'm not going to go over that again and again, but we see the problems. Now, let's look at some red flags, right? Irrational anger, irritability, and aggressiveness. When you see that going out of hand in yourself or in someone that you know, that could be a concern. That could be a sign of worsening mental health, worsening stress, misuse of substances. Again, something we're more socialized to do. But if you see somebody else or a friend or yourself, the smoking has ticked up, the drinking has ticked up, that might be a concern, right? Feeling flat or having a really difficult time feeling positive emotions. That's another very important point where, we sort of see this red flag that it's difficult for me to feel happy. It's, the things that I was doing before that made me happy are not making me happy anymore, right? Additionally, trouble fulfilling responsibilities at work or in your personal life. This involves things like, all your daily tasks that you need to be sort of a functioning adult. All of these factors come in and they get more difficult. So, how do we learn to accept those emotions? First and foremost, all emotions are usually there for a reason, and how you feel them versus how you express them are two different things. And once we learn how to do that more consciously, we can be more healthy about it. So, let's talk about how we embrace our emotions. First, think of this as a four-step process, right? And this is a good place if you want to take a screenshot or take some notes. This is a good four-step process to keep in your back pocket. You know, first and foremost, we have to acknowledge and honor the emotions. And what I mean by that is sit with it, recognize it for what it is and where it's coming from. Let it come for a few seconds. Let it arise, persist, and pass, right? If you feel uncomfortable or if you feel unsafe, talking to somebody about it, verbalizing these concerns, that can be a useful thing as well, right? Second, consider the positive intention of the emotion, right? When we have, let's say, for example, an anxiety attack, right? An anxiety attack is a very physical response where your heart starts beating really fast, you're under a lot of tension, you feel like a pit in your stomach, your hands might be twitchy or shaky, you might feel blood rushing to your extremities. Now that's a very physical response to a very strong emotion, and the reason it's there is because it's fight or flight. You would have the same reaction if there was a bad work appraisal or a meeting with your boss, or if there was someone pointing a gun at you. Your body is physically preparing to either fight or run away. There's blood rushing away from your stomach towards your muscles, all of those things, right? Your heart's beating faster because it's anticipating blood flow to the muscles. It's going to be necessary in a fight or flight situation. The problem is your mind doesn't distinguish between physical threats and psychological ones. So, though an anxiety attack is a horrible thing to experience, it's there for a reason and it's telling you something, right? So, when you sit and consider, why am I having this feeling? Why is this particular thing triggering a certain emotion in me? Try and look back to when that would have been like a useful reaction to have, right? If you take a soldier out of a war zone and you put them in civilian life and they hear a car backfire, they're immediately going to be on edge because to them that sounds like a gunshot and their mind is preparing them saying, you're under fire, you need to be ready, let's get you ready, you know? So there is a positive intention behind that, right? Then double check your story, double check your line of emotional reasoning, right? Sometimes our emotions and thoughts can be misplaced. And what that means we have to do is we have to double check where they're coming from, right? Am I frustrated at the thing that's in front of me that I'm feeling anger at? Or is my frustration from somewhere else and that I'm bringing to this point because this is an acceptable outlet, right? Choose your action once you have slowed yourself down. And again, emotions are volatile things. Sometimes they can come very quickly, and slowing yourself down is a very important part of this process so that you can do step four, which is choosing your action, right? Once you acknowledge, once you understand and you double check, you can think about what actions you can take going forward, right? Now, again, it helps to do things like taking a deep breath, pausing on your thoughts and feelings, and being intentional. Don't be automatic. Emotions come automatically. They don't ask for your permission. You don't choose to have an emotion. Emotions happen, but your actions have to be intentional. They can't also be automatic, right? So, learning to manage those emotions, right? That's the next part of the conversation that we're going to go into. Now, what do I do with all these feelings? Challenging unhealthy and unhelpful beliefs is a very important part of this. We've talked so much about all the negative attitudes we have about men's mental health, our stereotypes, our preconceived notions. So, challenging those unhealthy beliefs at an individual level, forget societal change or advocating for anything else, starting with yourself and saying, hey, eh, do I have healthy ideas when it comes to expressing my emotions? Do I need to have all these ideas? Does my manhood depend on being an emotional wreck, right? Is that hurting me in some cases, right? Remind yourself of the purpose and benefits of your emotional experience. Think about why it's there. Think about what it's telling you. And I just see some hands raised in the audience. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We will actually come to all of those at the end, right? But next step, labeling your emotions, right? Thinking about very consciously, what am I feeling right now? Doing something tangible like maintaining a log, exploring why. Let's say I have a really, really bad day at my job today. In fact, I've had like a month of bad days at my job, and I said to myself, look, I'm really going to quit. I'm done, right? It's not worth it. This job is not good for my mental health. But then my appraisal happens and they give me a big raise. And then I say, oh, you know what? Maybe it's not all that bad. Now, my memories in that point can also change in some level, right? I might not put as much weight to the last month of terrible days I've been having, and maybe my mental health is worth more to me than my paycheck at that point, right? But if I have a journal where I have written this down, I can reflect back and say, look, you might feel okay with your grace today. It's temporarily making you happy. But the past 1 month, you've written down how terrible you feel. Because ink on paper doesn't change no matter how much we rewrite our own experiences and our thoughts and our memories, right? So that's a useful thing, right? Very interesting. I see someone pointed out that's why men might love things like contact sports like MMA and boxing. Yeah, that's a very important point, right? Aggression being something that is a valuable emotion. Yeah, maybe there is a reason for that. Maybe there's a bias towards that. But let's talk on that note as we talk about MMA and boxing and contact sports. Let's talk about therapeutic hobbies, right? Finding out what makes you feel better is a very important thing. Reflect on the things that you do because sometimes distraction is a useful strategy. But remember therapeutic and healthy hobbies, right? The usual litmus test that I tell my clients, that I tell most people in these workshops is Ask yourself, if I did this hobby for the next 10 years, every single day, would there be a bad side effect? Now let's apply that test. If I was to journal every day, the worst thing that could happen to me if I did it every day might be a bad case of carpal tunnel. Not all that bad, right? On the other hand, if I was to take a drink every time I was stressed and I did that for the next 10 years, that would have a bad result. I might end up addicted. I might end up with other physical ailments as a result, right? If I went out for a walk every day, if I was having a bad day and I did that for the next 10 years, that's probably okay. I'd get more fresh air. I'd get more exercise. That's good. If I went to the gym, yeah, great. Probably okay. There is such a thing as doing that too much, right? There is such a thing of avoiding your feelings all the time by constantly relying on hobbies. So, this is one of many steps, keep in mind. But usually, those can help. Lastly, practice makes better. Note that we did not say practice makes perfect because that can be a little unhealthy as well, aiming for perfection all the time. But when I say this to all the men in the audience, if you're comfortable reaching out over a small thing, over having a small bad day, not a big life event, but let's just say you weren't feeling all that great today. If you're comfortable expressing that to somebody, start there so you can get practice in being open with your emotions. All of this is theory until we put it in action. When you can honestly answer the question, because we all ask each other, right? How's your day? How are you doing? How many of us give an honest answer to that question? How are you doing? Show of hands. Raise your hands if you give an honest answer. If you're having a bad day and somebody asked you, how are you doing? Would you tell them I'm having a bad day? Raise your hand if you'd say, yes, I would be honest with them. So 68 attendees, I see three people with their hands raised, and I believe, okay, there's four, but I think two of you had your hands raised a little earlier as well, right? So again, most of us are not really socialized to that kind of thing, right? So what I'm going to point out is that at this juncture, the best thing you can start to do is start there. When someone asks how your day is, be honest, right? Now, we're almost at the end, so we're going to get close to wrapping up very quickly. But things you can do to take care of your mental health: good self care. We've talked about therapeutic hobbies, we've talked about other things. Remember that your mind, body, and social well being are all linked, right? Engaging in self care, establishing good social connections, and then seeking the right professional help when you need it can be very, very useful, right? I do always say this to clients. One, always remember the therapy is anonymous. It's confidential, right? It may not be anonymous, but it is confidential, right? It stays between you and your therapist. And again, with online therapy, you can always kind of reach out, right? You can always seek one-to-one therapy through Amaha. And here's the other side of it. What is, what is the overall just downside to it? You know, what's the overall sort of side effect to going and talking to somebody, right? No one's asking for medication just yet. No one's encouraging that. The worst you can do is waste 50 minutes of your time having a comfortable conversation with everyone, right? With like the people that you professionally interact with. So do that. Now, how do you go about supporting the men in your life? Very simple. Understand a few basic things of they may not know how to talk about emotions, or they might be learning to overcome that, right? It's not always that men just don't want to. We may want to, but we may not have the vocabulary just yet because we haven't grown up being told to be comfortable about it. We haven't grown up learning the right words or learning that it's okay to say those words out loud. So there can be a learning curve, right? Additionally, it might be a process. Maybe we're still in the process of going through that and overcoming that social conditioning. So that patience is important. To all the men, talking to other men and hearing from other men, this is for you. For all the women, you're here as well. For anyone and everyone else, this is to you too, right? So, final things: supporting mental health, supporting men's mental health, rather. Simple things you can do: encourage them to speak up if they are troubled or worried about something, no matter how small. We've talked about what those red flags are. We've talked about those signs that increased drinking, increased irritability. You might see difficulty in, patterns, day-to-day routines, work responsibilities. If you see somebody having a rough time of it, you know, pull them to one side and just gently ask, like, hey, are you sure everything's all right? How are you doing? Let me know. You can talk to me, right? The best thing you can do right after that is to listen and not judge. It is a very human tendency to judge. It's very normal for us to constantly judge things, judge people, situations around us all the time, right? Nothing to it. But sometimes when men walk into that situation more aware that they might be judged for it, it makes them more hesitant, right? And lastly, a regular check in with somebody that you know is having a rough time can make a big difference, right? Those feelings of isolation, that idea that I have to deal with this alone, sometimes that little external push from somebody else reaching out and saying, hey, how are you doing? You mentioned you were having a bad day a couple of days ago. I thought I'd check in and say hi. Maybe we could do something. Maybe we could just talk, whatever it is, right? That thing of somebody else reaching out to us from the outside in can make a big difference. So, with that in mind, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank you all for joining us. And again, as I mentioned before, always remember therapy is confidential. It is a service that we provide. You can seek it through the Amaha app, and we have access to one-to-one therapy online. Now, all of you, I believe, have access to the app as well as therapy services. And depending on sort of what the state of it is, you can always get the app, sign in, book a session with us. There's a lot of self-help stuff on there as well that be very useful. Again, I don't see. Oh, yes. I just want to check in on questions. So, someone pointed out, is alcohol addiction a disease or a habitual psychological disorder? Well, that's a very good question. It's a bit of both. We do know that alcohol has a biologically addictive quality to it, right? In fact, we've given it to rats, and even they have shown alcoholism without the presence of what we would call a human mind or like a fully grown human psychology, right? So, yes, there is a definite biological and a psychological component to it both, but it's perhaps one that is a little more biological to that end. I hope that answers the spirit the question was asked in, right? By and large, in the world, we've started to see it more as a disease, and something that a person is sort of prone to rather than some sort of a choice that they are making, right? Excellent. Someone mentioned in the comments, it's liking, then addiction, and then best buddy. Yeah. When we don't have people to connect with, we connect with substances because that is what we're looking for. It is connection, right? Excellent. Any other questions before we close out? Okay. Well, I want to thank you all so much for joining us today and being a very participant audience. I don't think I've seen this many messages in chat, when it comes to it. I do see someone raising their hand. If you have any questions, please send them via chat or the Q&A. But thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you all so much for participating. But have a great day, have a great week, and I wish you the very best mental health. All right. Take care, everyone. Thank you for the good feedback.